Hi, I'm Elizabeth Brown. This is Crash Course Psychology, and today we are going to be talking about psychopaths. So, the first thing we must ask ourselves is, who fits the role of a psychopath? What? Behind me? Oh, very funny. I don't really think I fit the role of a psychopath, but according to this book, fitting the role might not be such a bad thing. My first proposal is Richard Nixon, 37th President of the United States. Let's investigate.
So let's start with the DSM's criteria for antisocial personality disorder, or ASPD.
Now, it's important to remember that not everyone diagnosed with ASPD is a psychopath. However, the interesting part is that all psychopaths do have ASPD. So when looking for someone who fits the role of a psychopath, looking at the criteria for ASPD seems like a reasonable place to start.
The first part of the criteria involves impairments in self-functioning, either involving identity or self-direction.
Nixon fits into the self-direction category, specifically the absence of pro-social internal standards associated with the failure to conform to lawful or culturally normative ethical behavior. I know this sounds like a lot, but basically it means that he disregards social acceptance and doesn't follow the law. What are you doing? I said to hang that so that I could read the quote from the DSM. Now everyone knows. You may be wondering, when did Richard Nixon not follow the law? I mean, he was the president, right? Yeah, well, his refusal to comply with congressional subpoenas is an example of him not following the law.
Nixon repeatedly resisted the subpoena, and when he finally did release the tapes that were under investigation, 18.5 minutes were missing. A clear obstruction of justice, not following the law.
And that's just one example. The whole Watergate scandal qualifies Nixon for this criteria, basically,
since he took part in criminal cover-up and violated the Constitution several times.
Second criteria, impairments in interpersonal functioning. Nixon lacks empathy. Nixon displays a lack of concern for the feelings of others throughout Watergate.
Example, Saturday Night Massacre. Nixon asks 3 employees to fire the special prosecutor investigating Watergate. 2 out of the 3 refused and resigned. Nixon lacked concern for their situation and was willing to lose them as employees because of that. Third, pathological personality traits in the domain of antagonism and disinhibition. In the antagonism category, Nixon is deceitful.
From providing hush money to the burglars to denying his involvement in the cover-up, Nixon was dishonest and misrepresented himself constantly.
In the disinhibition category, Nixon is irresponsible.
He lacks respect for promises and doesn't follow through with the promises made during his inauguration. Take a look at this.
I, Richard Nixon, do solemnly swear.
I, Richard Nixon, do solemnly swear
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
And will, to the best of my ability,
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
preserve and protect and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Nixon's resignation speech is where Dutton's book really comes into play. One of the characteristics of psychopaths that Dutton describes is their ability to hide truth through charm. In the DSM, this is seen as manipulation. Despite reported ties between the Watergate break-in and the White House, he was still re-elected. Was it luck, or was it his charm toward the American population? I like to think it was his charm that attracted the voters. Dutton also points out that psychopaths are actually better at faking remorse. Maybe that's why Nixon's resignation speech is so convincing. Just listen to this part.
I would have preferred to carry through to the finish, whatever the personal agony it would have involved. And my family unanimously urged me to do so. But the interests of the nation must always come before any personal considerations. I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first.
He isn't resigning with the country's benefit in mind. He's resigning to save himself, and I'm sure he had no regrets in doing so. Finally, Dutton describes a study that shows how psychopaths take less time to evaluate a problem than non-psychopaths in high-conflict scenarios. Nixon realizes the urgency of acting after the Watergate scandal is tied to the White House. And unfortunately, he takes much less time to evaluate the problem and doesn't think about the consequences, which is what ultimately hurts him.
There are 2 major flaws to my theory. If he really embraced the role of a psychopath, he would live in the present at all times, as described in the book. But Nixon is constantly concerned about the future of his presidency. Nixon would also display these traits throughout his life and in various different situations, as the DSM states. However, Nixon in the context of Watergate is really the only situation where I find these traits within him.
My next proposal is Brad Pitt. I know what you're thinking. I've gone too far with this one. Like Nixon, Pitt can be very charming. One of his friends insists that his appeal is largely due to his charm, some sort of magical charisma. As mentioned earlier in this video and throughout Dutton's book, charm is one of the important keys to success for psychopaths, especially when under pressure. Maybe that's why Pitt always looks so relaxed.
When Dutton describes his experience in the DSPD wards, the people he speaks with are very straightforward, almost to a point of discomfort.
Jim Harrison is the author of the novella that one of Pitt's films is based on, and he states that Pitt never gives the appearance
of trying to think of what to say next.
When Dutton describes the difference between people who only have ASPD and true psychopaths, he states that people with ASPD alone have added emotion, but a true psychopath lives in an emotionless void.
In the words of Jennifer Aniston,
there's a sensitivity chip that's missing. Hello? Oh. You don't think this proves Pitt is emotionless? Even so, the DSM includes lack of empathy in impairments in interpersonal functioning, which completely describes Pitt's lack of concern for others in his life. We already covered Pitt's excessive charm, which is in the manipulation category of antagonism in the DSM.
And if that's not enough for you, look at disinhibition in the DSM, specifically impulsivity.
Pitt was 2 credits away from getting a college degree. In his last semester, what did Pitt do? He dropped out of college to move to LA and try to become an actor. It was all very sudden, and as the DSM states, Pitt acted on the spur of the moment in response to immediate stimuli. He didn't have a plan, and he didn't consider the outcomes. So what are the flaws with the Brad Pitt theory? To be honest, I'm not really seeing any. Pitt fits into the criteria in various situations throughout his life, and he seems to be making the most of this unique personality. I thought Nixon was a good fit, but Pitt is even better. I know I said crash course, so you assume this would be a short video, but there's still one more question we must address. Do each of the major psychological perspectives apply to Dutton's theories and the criteria in the DSM regarding people who experience ASPD? Let's start with behavioral. This perspective definitely applies. This has to do with how humans learn observable responses. This perspective explains how psychopaths, who do have ASPD, are able to fake remorse. Psychopaths are able to learn the emotion, but they don't really feel it. This often creates the deceitfulness that the DSM describes. Psychopaths are able to respond in a cool, calm, and collected manner, and this is why Dutton suggests that some psychopaths may actually fit well in positions of power, such as CEOs or lawyers. Okay, humanistic. I don't really think this one applies too much. The problem with this perspective is that it deals with how we meet needs to ultimately reach self-fulfillment. This perspective has a lot to do with emotion and empathy, and although some people with ASPD do have emotion, they generally lack either empathy or intimacy.
When applied to Maslow's hierarchy, most people with ASPD would probably be stuck in the love and belongingness level, so this perspective wouldn't be of much help regarding individuals with ASPD.
Sociocultural, without a doubt, applies. Dutton describes a lawyer who must defend a man who is accused of rape. The lawyer makes the woman cry in court, and he never feels bad about it because that's his job. His job is to defend the man who is accused. Outside of court, he would never think of doing such a thing. And this is where this perspective comes into play. This perspective is all about looking at the context, because behavior and thinking can change depending on the situation or the culture. And this is exactly what we see in the situation described in Dutton's book. While the version of the man in court shows a lack of empathy, callousness, and other criteria that are seen in the DSM for people with ASPD, outside of court, this man is a completely different person. His attitude changes based on the situation, and that's really what this perspective describes. Evolutionary. It applies and apparently creates some debate. In a 2012 study, one psychologist found a negative correlation between psychopaths and violence against genetic relatives. This psychologist suggested that the disorder may actually be an evolutionary adaptation. Of course, this would suggest that the impairments in the DSM are actually beneficial. And to a certain degree, Dutton says that this may be true. But if having ASPD and being a psychopath is so beneficial, then why do so few people in our population have the disorder? Guess what? Cognitive applies too. This perspective looks at how our brain encodes, processes, stores, and retrieves information. A study by Ohira and Osumi dives into this perspective by creating a game with two players that are trying to decide how they should divide a sum of money they were given. The people without ASPD usually went into rejection mode with unfair offers. But people with ASPD actually accepted the offers despite them being unfair. They looked at the situation from an economic viewpoint instead of a moral viewpoint. People with ASPD are usually involved in risk-taking and impulsive acts, showing how the brain processes information and makes decisions in a different way than people without ASPD. Psychodynamic. Like the humanistic perspective, I don't really think this one applies. This perspective has to do with behavior coming from unconscious drives, and it also focuses on childhood experiences and how that affects adulthood. Although the DSM states that impairments in personality functioning and the individual's personality trait expression should be stable across time, meaning throughout the individual's life, I don't really feel that the psychodynamic approach addresses this properly. However, there is research in the Canadian Journal of Psychoanalysis that shows a greater than normal frequency of abuse in childhood of psychopaths. So this would be an example of how the psychodynamic approach could reveal some clues as to the causes of ASPD, both in people who have ASPD alone and in psychopaths. Last one, biological definitely applies. This perspective looks at the root of the disorder. The Mayo Clinic says that while the exact cause of ASPD is not known, certain genes may make some individuals more vulnerable to ASPD than others. A Harvard medical report, along with many others, describes the frontal lobe of people with ASPD as being different. Changes in the volume of brain structures in people with ASPD may be what causes them to be more aggressive or impulsive, the criteria that we see in the DSM. Dutton even talks about a study that showed people scoring high on the PPI as having reduced amygdala activity when compared to low scorers. The biological perspective is probably one of the most detailed lenses to look at when analyzing this disorder. Thanks again for watching Crash Course Psych. See you next time!